She got a job offer from Utah State, and she's been a professor in conservation ecology for the last 19 years. Dr. Beard's research lab researches a broad range of topics, but primarily focuses on species interactions and subsequent impacts on ecosystem processes, especially involving non-native species and climate change. Dr. Beard currently has research projects in Hawaii, Alaska, Brazil, and Utah, working on a wide range of taxa from amphibians, birds, plants, and microbes. The ultimate goal of her research is to improve decisions about how we manage habitats and species in the face of global change. And so just quick plug, last night I got to have dinner with her and discuss her. She's very approachable. So go ask her questions about her research, and some things involve flooding her own backyard. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Beard.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Is there a pointer that works? I guess I didn't. Is it that? Yep. Oh, okay, awesome. All right. Thank you all for coming today and for inviting me to come and speak. I'm really excited to be here. It's a great honor. So I am going to talk about the coqui frog invasion into Hawaii today, which is kind of a pet project of mine. It's something I've been working on for a long time, but I do work on a lot of other systems and other taxa, and I'm happy to talk about those other projects later today, or if we have time. I'm especially excited about some work I'm starting in Alaska this summer. Okay, so does this work? Okay. Before I begin, I wanted to thank the many graduate students that have been involved in my coqui research for the last over 20 years. So here I'm just showing about 7 master's students and 4 PhD students that have had theses involved in the coqui frog invasion in particular. And I certainly wouldn't be able to present the research today if it hadn't been for all of these students that have put in a lot of effort over the years. And they've studied topics on the invasion ranging from why landowners might be managing frogs on their properties to the genetics of the invasion. And most recently, we're looking at whether the frog is evolving, particularly to invade higher elevations. I'm not going to talk about everything we've done today. I'm mostly going to focus on the ecological consequences. And I also wanted to thank a lot of the undergraduate field technicians that have come out over the years. There's a wide range of people, a lot of them from Utah State. And I wanted to also thank the USDA Wildlife Services. They've been funding my research in Hawaii for about the last 20 years. And without them, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm going to show you guys today, as well as a lot of the private and state and federal landowners. Okay, so I thought I would start off by kind of setting the stage. Probably a lot of you have been to Hawaii or you're familiar with Hawaii. If not, I'm hoping to kind of bring your mind there because it's a very unique place. So it's not the most isolated archipelago in the world, but it is extremely isolated. It's 2,400 miles from the nearest mainland. And as I'm sure most of you know, it's a volcanic archipelago. So it evolved through volcanic eruptions. And when those eruptions happened and formed these islands, these were barren lands without any species present, right? And so it's been estimated that about 1 plant species per 100,000 years came to the island, being brought via wind or flotsam. And so this is, over a really long evolutionary time period, right? That species would come to these islands and evolve. And they think that about 280 plants got to Hawaiian Islands. And from those 280 plants, there was some adaptive radiation and evolution. And now there's about 1,000 native plant species that live on the Hawaiian Islands. And you can think about the other types of species that might have been blown there that way besides plants. So probably insects came and some birds, but not a lot, right? Got to these endemic, very isolated islands. And then as Polynesians started coming, they came by boats. It was difficult. They had to sail, mostly just from other Pacific islands. With them, they brought plant species, about one species every 50 years. And now, once Europeans started coming to the Hawaiian Islands, we're seeing plant species come once every 22 years. So much faster rate of plant species coming, right? So you can think about these islands and what probably evolved there, but it's a lot of endemic plants, insects, and birds. With these introductions, there's now over 2,000 plant species. So the plant species in Hawaii nearly doubled just because of our introductions. And what does this kind of mean for the islands? So I'm showing here some maps before human arrival and the types of vegetation that you could find. This is Oahu, Oahu and Kauai and Maui. And you can see with this orange and this green, these are lowland habitats. And now this is what it looks like today. And this gray here is non-native vegetation. So there's a lot of loss of native vegetation, particularly in the lowlands, and a lot of non-native vegetations dominate those areas now. Over 60% of the islands are dominated by non-native vegetation. So what about the fauna? So I was talking about how insects probably got there and birds, and those species also evolved once they got there. There's only one mammal species that's native to Hawaii. It's the hoary bat. And as far as reptiles and amphibians, the only one that's native are the sea turtles. So, but what do the islands look like today? Well, there's been 33 non-native amphibian and reptile introductions. I just show some of them here. So how did these amphibians and reptiles get to such an isolated archipelago? A lot of them were purposely introduced, like the bullfrog for culinary purposes, or the cane toad as a biocontrol agent. Some were accidentally introduced, like the blind snake. But a lot of them actually were introduced via the pet trade. And that's true not just in Hawaii, but on a lot of islands like Puerto Rico as well. So that's just something to think about. A lot of these amphibians and reptiles that were introduced were not particularly disliked by people in Hawaii. In fact, when I went to Hawaii for the first time in the 80s, the house gecko was their kind of state mascot. Over time, they've transitioned that to the sea turtle, which makes a lot more sense to me. But some of these species have been there a long time and are part of their culture. The species I'm going to talk about today was accidentally introduced and was not very well received. So that's the coqui frog. The coqui is an endemic species to Puerto Rico. And I started studying the coqui during my dissertation. So for my dissertation, I was interested in looking at what the loss of amphibian species might do for the communities and ecosystems that they inhabit. And it was around that time that people were very worried about amphibian loss and the major declines that we were seeing globally with these species. And I thought, well, if some amphibian species is likely to have an impact, it'd be one that has really high densities, that's kind of a major player in the system. And so that kind of led me to the Puerto Rican coqui, which has one of the highest densities of any amphibian species in the world. And so while I was studying it, and this was in the late 90s, around 2000, there was a paper that came out from Hawaii, and it said that the very species I was studying had invaded Hawaii, and that this might be of concern to those islands. And this was really interesting to me because I thought, well, I'm looking at its role in its native community and ecosystem in Puerto Rico, but what is it going to do in this totally novel area? So the coqui was introduced, we believe, in the late 1980s to the Big Island. It wasn't, like I said, until like the late 90s that they really noticed that it was there and that it might be a problem. It was also introduced separately to Maui. The coqui came in via nursery plants. So these were plants from the Caribbean that are then sold in Hawaii. So it was a hitchhiker, it was introduced into nurseries, and it's now quite abundant and widespread on the Big Island. And it's also found on Maui. It has made it to all the major islands. So for those of you that aren't familiar, this is Big Island, this is Maui, this is Oahu, and this is Kauai. They were actually able to eradicate it off of Oahu and Kauai. And I'm going to talk about how they did that later today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of natural history of the species because I think it helps understand how it might have been so invasive. So the coqui is a terrestrial frog, and what that means is that it doesn't require water bodies to breed in, so it doesn't have a larval phase or tadpole phase, and it lays eggs directly in the leaf litter or in the in bark or near the forest floor, sometimes in rocks. And so when it lays eggs, it's kind of interesting in that it has male parental care. So the males sit on the eggs until they hatch. And then about 2 weeks later, the eggs hatch and very small, tiny froglets come out that look like adult coquis, but they're very small. And you find those little juveniles all over the forest floor. So it breeds year round as well. And so I think the fact that it doesn't require water bodies to breed in, and these males are often kind of hiding and sitting on these eggs, you can imagine you don't require that many to have 20 or 40 or 60 frogs introduced into an area. So why are they trying to control the coqui spread? Let me see if this works. Oh, did I hit it on here? Coqui? That's what it's saying. Okay, so that's a calling male, and the males call year round all night long. And you maybe can't tell from this because it's volume controlled, but they call at about 80 to 90 decibels from just a couple feet away. So I don't know if you're familiar with how loud that is, but it's like a loud lawnmower. And the native Hawaiian forest doesn't really have that much noise. So when the coquis invaded and they could reach really high densities, they produce like a wall of sound. And this didn't make a lot of Hawaiians very happy. So this is a quality of life issue for them. A lot of them complain of lack of sleep and just noise. You know, people that owned Airbnbs, tourists wouldn't want to stay in areas where there were infestations. There was a study early on that showed that real estate value also went down where people had frogs on their properties. So now it's required that you say on the deed of sale that you have an infestation, so people are aware that there are frogs there. And this resulted in at least $7 million of real estate loss for people. The nursery industry was also very hard hit because the frog came in from nurseries, and that's mostly how they continue to spread through the sale of plants on the islands. Nursery owners had to do their own control measures. So they would have to spray plants, you know, make sure they didn't have infestations. They'd have to get certification that they were coqui free to be able to sell plants. And they had to bear the brunt of all of that economically. Resulted in reduced sales for nurseries that had frogs, and even some nurseries closed as a result of this. So I mentioned this early on because it's the social and the economic issues associated with this invasion that caused Hawaii to do control measures and try to eradicate them. So it was well before we really had a lot of information on what their ecological impacts would be, that they were already trying to control their spread. One of my PhD students was interested in this kind of social dynamic part of the invasion, and she did this survey that she sent out to the Big Island as well as the other islands to kind of get a sense of how people felt about the coquille and whether they were doing management efforts on their property and things like that. And she found that there was, I think this was interesting, which is why I mentioned it, but she found that there was less dislike, if you will, of coquilles with more experience with them. So landowners that had experience with coquilles or people on the Big Island versus other islands that had more experience actually started to dislike the coquille less. And so this is kind of a learn to live with it, or kind of getting just used to the fact that the frog was there. It happens over time, which I think is kind of interesting. And the other kind of interesting part of this is that the Puerto Rican coquille in Puerto Rico is beloved. So it's the exact same frog, exact same sound. I've worked in both places. People ask me that. But there it's their national mascot. It's something that's part of their folklore and their culture. And so it's really interesting to see this contrast between a place that, you know, had no previous experience with this species and a place that everyone there has grown up with it, have really different opinions. So this paper by Fred Krause that came out in the late 90s, he's a herpetologist and he was working at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. He wrote this paper and he said, this is going to be a problem that this frog got here. It's going to have some ecological impacts. And the three main ways through which he saw that happening was that he said the coquille is an insectivore, so it's going to reduce insect populations. And this is particularly of concern in a place like Hawaii, where a lot of the endemic species are invertebrates. The second hypothesis that he came up with was, he said, a lot of native birds are insectivores. And so the coquille is going to compete potentially with native birds for insect prey. And third, he said these non-native mammals, such as mongoose and rats, that are known kind of horrific bird nest predators, they're going to start consuming coquilles. Coquilles are going to bolster their populations, and that's going to result in more nest predation. So these are some of the questions that I wanted to investigate when I started doing research there. But before I get to that, these are some other things we did. So one thing we did was just kind of determine where is the coquille. So this was back in 2007. We drove the major roads on the Big Island, and it determined presence, absence of the frog. And you can see that the red points here are presences and the black points are absences. And these blue dots are places where people were calling in where they had heard the frog. So, so you can see that pretty early on in the invasion anyway, they were mostly on the eastern side. This is the wet side of the Big Island. And then we set up study sites to kind of look at some populations and get population density estimates. And most of my work is on the Big Island because that's where the coquille is widespread and abundant. So we went to these sites for 3 years and did mark recapture and got population density estimates. And we found that in some locations, their densities were over 90,000 frogs per hectare. So just to give you an idea of what that means, that's 9 frogs per meter squared. That's a lot of frogs. This is like over 4 times the amount that you would see kind of on average in Puerto Rico. So it's a lot. And the next thing we wanted to do was just get kind of a snapshot of like, what are they eating here? So we did a diet, stomach content analysis, and we did it at the same site. So we did these market capture studies. I wanted to know like where they were eating too. So we collected insects that were flying and insects that were on the plants, and also insects in the leaf litter. And so we looked at these snapshots of their stomach, and here's a multivariate analysis kind of showing what that study showed. But the black is their stomach contents and the red is the litter samples. And you can see that the stomach and the litter samples really overlapped. So that showed us that they were mostly eating in the leaf litter. And this is kind of interesting to me because in Puerto Rico, the frogs are known to mostly eat on the foliage. And we think that they've kind of shifted more to the leaf litter in Hawaii because there's a lot more prey there and they don't have as many predators to control them like they do in Puerto Rico. Another thing we wanted to know was, were they eating native insects? And so we identified what we found in the stomach to whether or not they were native or non-native. And one thing that's really kind of makes it simpler in Hawaii is because it's such a unique archipelago, there's whole taxa of insects that have never made it there. So all ants, for example, are non-native, cockroaches are non-native, amphipods, isopods. So we knew right away when we were seeing these taxa in the stomach, these are non-native insects. And then there's some groups like mites and collembola or springtails that do have native species in them. But we had experts work with us and identify what we were finding. And over 70% of the prey were non-native insects. So they're mostly eating non-natives. Okay, so we wanted to know in general though, how are they affecting insect communities? How are they affecting small mammal communities? And how are they affecting bird communities? And so to approach this general question, I decided to work at what we called invasion fronts. And so these were places on the landscape where the coqui had invaded, but appeared to still be continuing to invade, so that we could look at what the communities were like where the coqui was, and also places where it kind of hasn't gotten yet, but where the habitat is pretty homogeneous throughout that area. So I'll show you a little bit more what I mean. So these are some examples of our study sites. So we'd find places where the habitat looked the same and everything that we could measure was the same. But there'd be something like a road that maybe the coqui just hadn't crossed yet, or the coqui was spreading out of a parking lot and it hadn't reached kind of farther into the forest. So this way we could attribute anything we were seeing just to the invasion and not to habitat change. And then along these 15 invasion fronts, we measured insect communities on both sides. We also used variable circular plots to measure bird communities on both sides of the invasion. We set out trapping webs where we collected small mammals to look at their populations on both sides of these invasions. And we also did artificial nests to look at nest predation rates on both sides of the invasion. So as far as the insect communities on both sides, we again looked at the three I talked about before, but we looked at flying insects, foliage insects, and leaf litter insects. And what we found was that where coquis had invaded, there was a reduction in leaf litter insects. So it wasn't too surprising to us since we already knew from the stomach contents that's mostly where they were foraging. But we saw a reduction of about 27% in abundance of leaf litter insects where the coqui had invaded. This is, to me, pretty remarkable. I wasn't sure I was going to see something like this because insects are known to be really spatially and temporally variable, and there's so many types out there. But to see this kind of like strong reduction where the coqui invaded really implies that they're having a huge impact. We also saw kind of a general shift in the insect communities. So we saw decreased mites, decreased ants, springtails, and isopods where they invaded. And something that I think is kind of interesting is we also saw an increase in certain types of diptera where they were invading. And so these are flies that would be particularly associated with decomposing bodies or feces. And we think that they are increasing just because of the large biomass that coquis bring in when they invade an area. Okay, so now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about their potential impacts on birds. So remember that the initial hypothesis was that because a lot of native birds are insectivorous, they might be declining where the coqui comes in because they're competing with coqui for insect prey. And I just show this sign because I think it's kind of funny. This project was done by one of my master's students. And when we first showed up to Hawaii and we were kind of checking out our sites, we went to one of the state parks and there was a sign there that talked about the coqui invasion, and it answered the very question she was asking. It said, coquis compete with native birds for insects. And we were like, it's kind of interesting it says that because there's no data that actually shows that yet. So we'll see if that's true. So we went to these 15 sites where we had these variable circular plots on both sides of the invasions, and she measured bird communities in those plots over about a year period. And on the coqui side, she determined presence absence of the coqui, but also their density. But we knew that it wasn't just coquis that birds might be responding to. So we measured things in the habitat, such as native canopy cover or understory cover, that might be linked to bird distributions more than the coqui. And we also got some climate data for these sites to just see if that was what might better explain native and non-native bird distribution. So all those things were included in these models, and we did these N mixture models. So I'll just show you some of the results. So about 4 native bird species overlapped with coquis in our plots. And this was of interest, what native birds we'd even see, because our research is mostly in the lowlands, because that's where the coqui is invaded. And a lot of native birds are now restricted to the higher elevations in Hawaii, where the native vegetation remains, and also because of avian malaria. So avian malaria is it's mostly in the lowlands, and it's restricted a lot of the native birds to higher elevations because the mosquitoes can't live up high. So these are the species we saw, but these species are kind of widespread birds in Hawaii, so the less endangered, if you will. So these are kind of the ones that we thought we might see. We didn't see too many Hawaiian hawks, so we weren't able to model their what determined their presence and absence, but we were for the other native species that you see here. And so what we found overall was that native birds, so this is all the abundance of all native bird species, was mostly determined by the percent native cover of vegetation. So that's not too surprising. There's a positive relationship between native vegetation and native bird abundance. But the coqui did not appear in that model or the model for any of the native species that we were looking at. So the other 3 species were also mostly being determined by canopy height or native cover and a positive relationship. What about the non-native birds? So of the birds that we counted out there, about 80% of them were non-native birds. So a lot more abundant than the native species. And non-native birds in general, their distribution was being impacted by the presence of coquis. And what we actually found was a positive relationship between coqui density and non-native bird abundance. So this is opposite from what we thought we'd see. We were thinking that there'd be a competitive relationship, that they'd be competing for insects, and then we'd see a reduction in birds. We actually saw an increase of non-native birds. And there were several bird species that we could model their distribution and what might be determining it. And 3 of our non-native bird species had coquis pop up in the models as an explanation for their abundance, either coqui presence, absence, or density. And all 3 of these species are species that we kind of a priori would have guessed had the capacity to consume coquis. So what we're actually seeing is that non-native birds seem to be increasing where coquis are invading, and it's because they're using coqui as a novel prey resource. So just some conclusions from this study was that no insectivorous birds or birds at all seem to be declining where the coqui was invading. So competitive interactions didn't seem to be very important. And it's actually these non-native vertebrate preying kind of generalist birds that seem to be taking advantage of the coqui invasion. And if you think back about those little juvenile frogs, you can imagine that they're about the size of insects. So for these birds, this is just another kind of prey resource. And so it's the bird coqui predatory interactions that actually seem to be more important than competitive interactions. And for some of these species, like the common myna, it's actually a pest species. So the fact that the coqui is increasing them is a bad thing for Hawaii. Our model suggested that there's a 97% chance that you would see a 50% increase in non-native birds where the coqui invades. So that's a lot. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the interactions with non-native mammals and also bird nest predation rates. So we did those trapping webs. So here I'm showing the capture per unit effort from that, and that's what this density index is. And you can see here that, so we had, again, those 15 plots with coqui and non-coqui, that in coqui plots, we actually could measure that mongoose seemed to be increasing, and they increased by 30% where the coquis were invading. So that's pretty dramatic. And we also caught in our plots black rats and Pacific rats. Black rats are a little bit more arboreal, so they're more in the trees, and Pacific rats are more non-arboreal, more on the ground. We didn't see any relationship between black rats and coquis. We saw like a small reduction in them, but it wasn't significant. But the Pacific rats, which are non-arboreal, seem to decline where the coqui was invading. And so this was interesting to us because we thought that the rats might be increasing if they're using the coquis as a prey resource. So why are the mongoose increasing? Well, we think it's because the mongoose can use the coquis as a prey. And we did stomach content analyses to kind of get at that. And we found that there are some coqui in the stomachs in coqui plots where there are no coquis in the non-coqui plots, but they aren't a huge part of the diet. So, so that was kind of interesting. We thought they'd be larger. This is just a snapshot. So it is just, you know, what's in the stomachs when you capture them. And we have done other trapping webs out there in other state parks that weren't part of this study. And we have found that some mongoose can have up to 14 coqui in their stomachs. So there are mongoose that can take advantage of them and will eat a lot of them. So we might just not have captured that in this study as much. And we also think that there's a general shift in their diet as well between coqui and non-coqui plots. So we thought that general shift might just result in a higher fitness level for mongoose. So we did, as you just saw in the last thing, we did set out camera traps with dead coquis. So we wanted to see what species was scavenging them. And the mongoose are the main group that eats our scavenged coquis. So about 60% of the time they were taken by mongoose. But we did find that rats will take them as well as wild boar, cats, birds, just about anything out there will take them once in a while. So what is resulting in this reduction of rats with coquis? So we had two kind of hypotheses about this. One is an apparent competition hypothesis where we thought the coqui might be increasing mongoose and that results in a reduction in rats. We actually don't have too much support for this hypothesis because for a few different reasons. But one is if you look at coqui plots versus non-coqui, we don't see as many rats in their stomachs in the coqui plots. So this suggests that mongoose aren't eating more rats where the coqui has invaded. The other hypothesis we had was that the coqui might be competing with particularly Pacific rats for insects. So resource competition hypothesis, and might indirectly reduce the rats that way. We had more support for this because it was the coquis that showed up in the Pacific rat model, not the mongoose. But also, if you look at what they're eating, the Pacific rats are eating less arthropods when the coquis are there. So that kind of suggests that they might be competing for insect resources. Of course, both of these hypotheses could be happening at some level, but we kind of have more support for the resource competition hypothesis. As far as nest depredation rates, we didn't see any significant change in the coqui and non-coqui plots. And we think that has to do with a few things. One is that the black rats that are more arboreal, which are strong nest predators, weren't being impacted significantly by the invasion. Also, we were seeing that mongooses increase, but Pacific rats decrease. And so there could be some kind of balancing of those two impacts on nest predation rates. Okay, so now I'm going to shift and just talk about one other study that we did looking at ecological impacts. And this study, So this study was looking at not just their effects in the food web, but also their effect on ecosystem processes, if you will. So what I mean by that is, do the coquilles affect things like herbivory rates or plant growth rates, or the rate at which nutrients are cycling through the system, or leaf litter decomposition rate? So different processes that kind of affect nutrient cycling and productivity. And to get at this question, we used enclosures. So we did this enclosure experiment. So we had 20 coquille and 20 non-coquille enclosures that we had at 2 sites on the Big Island to get at this. And in those enclosures, we put things like potted plants to measure response rates with and without the coquille, leaf litter decomposition bags, etc. And this experiment actually is a replicate of one of the things I did during my dissertation in Puerto Rico. So we had both the native and the non-native comparison to do, which is interesting. So I'm just going to summarize the results here, but we found that in the coquille enclosures, there was less herbivory. So coquilles reduced herbivory rates. And this was kind of interesting to us because we didn't see that they were eating that many foliage insects in Hawaii, but they seem to be able to still reduce the damage to plants, particularly for strawberry guava, which is one of the worst invasive plants in Hawaii. If any of you have ever been there and you've seen those thickets of just woody plants where you can't even walk through the wall, that's strawberry guava. So it's a really bad species to be helping. We also found that when the coquille was present, there's an increase in plant growth rates. And we measured this by the number of new leaves produced. And this was, again, particularly seen in strawberry guava. So where coquilles are, plants can grow faster. And I find this result remarkable because I don't feel like there's too many examples of a predator increasing plant growth rates like this. I call the coquille a predator. I'm a little mesopredator. A couple other things that we measured in the enclosures, we measured through fall chemistry. So this is just water coming off of leaves. And we had done this in Puerto Rico because in Puerto Rico, the coquilles are often higher in the foliage at night. They're sitting on the leaves and they're eating insects and defecating. And we thought that might measurably affect the chemistry coming off those leaves. And we found the same thing we found in Puerto Rico, that both ammonium and phosphorus were higher in through fall where coquilles were present. So they do go up and still kind of do that in Hawaii. They just don't go quite as high up. So that suggests that they're kind of increasing nutrient cycling rates. And then we had these leaf litter decomposition bags, which is a standard way of measuring how fast nutrients are going back into the system. And we found that coquilles increase leaf litter decomposition rates. So leaves decompose faster when coquilles are present. So putting all of this a little bit together, we had some hypotheses about why coquilles might influence plant growth rates. And we had kind of 2 main hypotheses. One was that by reducing herbivory, just by reducing damage, that might increase plant growth rates. Alternatively, because coquilles are affecting the nutrients coming off of leaves and into the soil, that kind of fertilization effect by the coquille might increase plant growth rates. And so we did a structural equation model to kind of get at these 2 hypotheses. And while we found that coquilles reduced herbivory, there was no significant link between herbivory and plant growth rates. But when we looked at this nutrient cycling effect, we found that increase in both ammonium and phosphorus, and that fertilization effect was highly associated with this increase in plant growth. So it was actually a fertilization mechanism through which the coquille increases plant growth rates. And we found this in both Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And as far as leaf litter decomposition rates, we kind of again had 2 main hypotheses about what might be driving that. So we thought, well, we know the coquilles eat a lot of leaf litter insects. They might be changing that community in a way that influences leaf litter decomp. Or again, they could have this fertilization effect where nutrients are coming off the leaves and landing on the leaf litter, and this is causing it to decompose faster. Again, we did a structural equation model and found that it was this fertilization mechanism that results more in this change in leaf litter decomposition rates than through the insect community, which is probably the way that we would have thought it would happen. So what's kind of going on here? Coquilles appear to increase nutrient cycling rates, and this results in faster growth rates of plants as well as faster return of nutrients to soil. And it's actually the non-native plant species that seem to be able to better take advantage of this, because we had both native and non-native plant species in our enclosures, and it was the non-native species that were growing faster with the coquille. And this isn't that surprising because the native plants have grown up or evolved, if you will, in a more nutrient poor environment. So it's not too surprising that they can't take advantage of these nutrient pulses the way that some of the non-native plants can. I think bigger picture, we've kind of tried to think about, why is this happening? Like this predator, why is it increasing nutrient cycling rates? And I think it does have something to do with a particular system we're looking at. So we're dealing with an amphibian that's highly decomposable, that has a lot of biomass, and it's eating a prey, insects that are kind of nutrient sinks. Their bodies are not very decomposable, and it's converting those insects into more available nutrient forms. So I think that this idea that a predator could really increase nutrient cycling rates by eating its prey is maybe unique to our system and not something that we'd always see. So that's kind of, I think, an interesting finding. So big picture, putting this kind of, again, all together, what's going on? So the coquille has invaded Hawaii, mostly in the lowlands, as I pointed out. And we have found that it can increase nutrient cycling rates, which mostly the non-native plants can take advantage of. It also seems to be increasing non-native birds. It's reducing insects, but mostly non-native insects. It's also increasing non-native mongoose, and it seems to be reducing non-native rats. So as you can see from this, the coquille seems to have inserted itself into this non-native novel food web that never existed before in Hawaii. It's really just a function of all the introductions that we've done there. And we've put these species together from all over the world, and we've said, okay, now how are you going to interact? And this is what we're finding. But they don't seem to have a lot of impact on native species. And that's because there's not that many native species in the habitats that the coquille has invaded. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about managing the frogs. So how are they controlling the coquille? So Hawaii has made a major effort, major campaign to control and eradicate the coquille off of Hawaii. Way back when they started doing this, the USDA tried to identify a bunch of chemicals that could be used in control. The first one they came up with was caffeine, and it was extremely effective, but the EPA never approved it for long-term use. So they don't use that anymore. Then they came up with citric acid, so 16% solution of citric acid, which is a food additive, and they found it's very effective at killing frogs. And they didn't have to get approval because it's a food additive. And then another chemical they came up with was hydrated lime. And that, again, was never approved for long-term use, but is also effective. Back in the early 2000s, the state was spending about $3 million per year to control the frog. They're still spending nearly that. So here I'm just showing some control efforts that happened on the Big Island from 2007 to 2010. It shows you kind of when they happened and what hectares they were covering. But what I kind of want you to get from this is that there was, a lot of effort going on. They were really trying to control the frog on the Big Island. And around 2010, the island decided that it just wasn't going to work, and they gave up. They said the coquille is too widespread, it's too abundant, we're just never going to eradicate it. So this is kind of a waste of effort. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we drove these major roads and determined presence absence back in 2007, but we did this again last summer. And what you can see is where the coquille has spread on the Big Island since that time. So it's mostly spread on the western side, which is a little drier, where Kona is, maybe, if you guys have been there. The south side, there's a few more dots. And then up on the north, they've also become much more abundant. So this kind of happened in light of us stopping to try to control their spread. They're continuing to spread. And what was interesting to me was back in 2007, we did a climate niche model to see where they might spread on the Big Island. And we predicted quite well that they would invade on this west side, on the south side, and also up in the north. So that's kind of interesting. We predicted the future, which I'm proud of. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about Kauai and Oahu. So the koki did get to Kauai and Oahu, and it had kind of incipient small populations there. And so around the time that they were still really trying to control the koki on the Big Island, Kauai and Oahu were focused on eradicating them off of the islands because they didn't have that many of them, and they saw what was happening to the Big Island. So there was a 20-hectare infestation on Kauai that the Kauai Invasive Species Council decided they were going to get rid of. And to do that, they did a lot of mechanical control, so just moved massive amounts of biomass, vegetation, non-native, from the area. And they also doused the area with citric acid, hydrated lime over and over again for several years. And they were able to eradicate the frog off the island. So they made Kauai koki free. And Oahu had a very similar situation, did the same thing, and they were also able to eradicate them. I think this is unique because I don't know of too many examples of a frog eradication like this off of an island. And so I don't know if too many people know about it, but I think it's pretty fascinating that they were able to control them and get rid of them. Now, Maui, on the other hand, so Maui is in the middle, and it's also in the middle in terms of koki invasions. So it has a major infestation on the north part in this gulch called Maliko Gulch. And it's a very large gulch, and it's very difficult terrain and really hard to get into and to control the frog in. They've been trying to get rid of the frog from this gulch for about 10 years. They knock it back, but they have not been able to get rid of it. They do all kinds of things. They've run PVC pipes down into the gulch where they bring citric acid into the bottom of the gulch. They spray the areas, they spray from the top. They've been doing helicopter drops of citric acid into this region for many, many years, over and over again. They haven't been able to get rid of it from there, but they have eradicated the frog from, see these green dots, or where they've done small eradications on the island of Maui. Just recently, Maui got $2.5 million to continue doing koki control and eradication. And they're using that money to get 4 more crews to work in Maliko Gulch. And they're also using it to help communities. So community groups in Hawaii have actually been very active in the control and eradication efforts. They're motivated because they want to get the koki out of their neighborhoods, and they need training, and they need citric acid, and they need equipment. And so this money goes towards those groups and helping them do that. And of course, there's also education that's part of this. So what does the future hold? Well, our climate niche modeling suggests that the koki could be on all the other islands. That's the green there. And so if Kauai and Oahu want to remain koki free, it's going to require eternal vigilance to do that. Since the koki got to Hawaii, they've invaded California, where they're mostly restricted to nurseries. I don't believe they've established really outside of them, but they also have gotten to Costa Rica, where they are spreading. And I think some things that we've learned from Hawaii is that we now do have control efforts or eradication methods that can work, especially with incipient populations. So if places wanted to use those, they could. But some of these other islands are going to just require eternal vigilance, especially because the Big Island has so many kokis on it. And that's all I have for today. So thank you.
Hi, great talk.
Oh, thanks.
I'm wondering the eradication efforts to get rid of the coqui, those sprayings, were there any adverse effects to other organisms in those ecosystems from that?
Yeah, so the USDA was required to do like non-target studies with all the chemicals they were developing. And so it's, yeah, I think the first thing is that there's no native amphibians in Hawaii, and things like earthworms are also non-native. So a lot of the things that would be negatively impacted in these systems are non-native. And then when they look at things like insect population responses, they see kind of immediate diebacks to the spraying, but they bounce back within a week or two. So, you know, can things be negatively impacted? I think they can be. I think there can be native species that would be negatively impacted by that. They've obviously decided that it's worth the risk.
Hey, Karen,
Yeah.
great talk. Thanks.
Okay.
I was doing work in the early 2000s on the Big Island, and was staying during those studies near Lava Tree State Park, right? And
that's where that sign was from.
In that area, they had recently defoliated all the non-native species.
Yeah.
And sprayed the citric acid everywhere to get rid of the coquis, because like you said, I mean, you could barely sleep at night. I remember before they did that. But then the locals, as you noted, became incensed that they were furious that they were taking these actions to defoliate the park and spray these chemicals, and they become quite fond. Now that was 20 years ago. Are you privy to the sort of, you said they've sort of given up the attempts to control since 2010. What have sort of public opinions become in relation to this non-native species in a place that's pretty conscientious about some of the negative impacts of non-natives?
Yeah, it's complicated. So Lava Tree was kind of ground zero for the coqui invasion on the Big Island. So it was the site that had like 89,000 frogs per hectare. And yeah, they loved those lava tubes, and they would breed, and there'd be so many in there. So yeah, that was pretty early on. They decided to try to eradicate them out of that state park. And they did a lot of that biomass, it's non-native vegetation they're removing, but not everybody knows what's native and non-native vegetation in Hawaii. So what a lot of people saw was just a denuding of the landscape. And then they did a lot of spraying. And I think part of the reason it's been hard to get rid of them on the Big Island is also it's the newest island. And so it's got the most volcanic type soil, and the coquis just hide in there. And so it's really hard to control them. Whereas in Kauai, the soil is more like soil. And so they can't hide as much. Yeah, and there was way back when, there was a particular individual that really loved the coquis and was actually actively spreading them to state parks and dropping them off in parking lots. And he had, other people that supported him in that effort. And so there was like a counter effort going on while people were trying to control them, which was infuriating to the people trying to control them. So there are people that like the coqui. It's a mixed bag. Like I was saying with my student study who looked at their opinions, even I think there's people that inherently, are opposed to that kind of control of a vertebrate anyway, right? So you have that group. And then I think there's also just people that maybe didn't even like them at first, but have kind of gotten used to them as well. But even like we were just there last summer, and plenty of landowners told me they hate them still. So there's diversity of opinions for sure. And I don't mean to impose any on, I'm just reporting.
Hi, Dr. Beard. Thank you. I wondered, you described your invasion fronts where you had one side with frogs and one side without. Did those move at all throughout the course of your study? And how did you account for that, and how fast did that happen?
Yeah, so the bird and the small mammal study were done really close together, but the insect study was done a little bit earlier on. And so when we went back out for the bird study, that was, we were looking for that, like, oh, have the fronts moved? The good thing about the coqui for studying them and for trying to control them is that they're very loud. So you know where they are and you're not surprised later. So we did have to adjust where some of those fronts were for the bird study. They are moving, and there's from 2007 to 21, long time period, but you can see that they've spread, and a lot of that, some of it's cars and things, but a lot of it's just natural spread.
Sorry, going back to the survey that you guys gave out, I was wondering if there was a noticeable difference in attitudes toward the coqui between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities.
That's a really good question. I don't know that we separated it that way in the paper. That's a good question. I'm hesitant to even say. I feel like there would maybe be more Indigenous on the Big Island. So, but I'm not sure of that. So that would be something to look at.
All right, I think that's it. Well, let's thank Dr. Beard again.
Thank you.